Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about architects and gardeners, the two approaches to writing. I'm coming at this from a variety of different perspectives, not just as a ghostwriter who is trying to make money, but also as a creative and as someone who has been writing for, well, a long time now. Ever since I was really young, I would write as a way to cope with things in my life. So some of my earliest writings actually go back to when I was around 7 years old. So over time, I gained my own perspective and my own approaches to writing. And when I would listen to other creatives around me, I would start wondering, am I crazy? Am I doing something wrong? And I did go through a period of self-doubt when I was in my 20s, but by the time I hit my mid-30s, I came out of whatever it was, and I embraced the approach that I preferred. And whenever anyone says something about passion and creativity, I'm always careful to check myself so that I don't take it too personally, and I just accept that people have different ways of talking and thinking about creativity, and my process doesn't have to look like their process. For real. I might be extremely passionate about my work, but that doesn't mean I have to do what everyone else is doing. I can go at it at my own pace, in my own way, and ultimately, I do believe that my approach is actually very helpful if for people who want to make money or who want to go about writing in a more professional kind of way, particularly if you are trying to deal with long-term projects. So let's get into it, shall we? And let's first talk about the truth. All right. So first off, when I'm talking about architects and gardeners, I do want you to take this conception with a grain of salt. It's not so much of a binary choice as a spectrum. And you will discover that you may be shifting over time, or you may also be shifting depending on your project or the genre you're working with. So you may not stick in one aspect all the time. You might actually find yourself ping-ponging between the two. But generally speaking, if we're talking about writing a novel, there are going to be two approaches to writing. And one is called the architect, or what I call the architect, and one is called a gardener. And these two approaches are quite different, but they can both result in very great content. It can result in a very, very good book. And certainly we should never, ever judge a book by how the author went about writing it. We should judge it based on its merits, its end result. So once again, don't freak out if you're like, oh yes, I love organization, but when I'm writing a sonnet in the morning, it just comes to me. Like, you don't need to explain it away too much, but it is a very fascinating way to analyze yourself, to understand where you might lie and what strengths and weaknesses you will have as a result, and how you can also tackle any issues that might arise depending on what type you are. So let's first talk about gardeners. So gardeners, I think that there are quite a few people who are gardeners. Generally speaking, artistic types are often stereotyped as being very much go with the flow and feeling your core. Like those women in, was it Trouble with Angels, where they were like willows? The thing about gardeners is that they tend to go with the flow. Okay, they're more organic, and that's why I give them the term gardeners. Generally speaking, gardeners are more empowering because they have this sense of just doing it, right? So you just sit down and start writing. And I think in some ways, because you're not restricting yourself in any kind of capacity and you're just noodling along, you have this feeling of, I can do anything. And the end result is that many times this creative process is going to be more emotionally or psychologically explorative. it will result in experiential focused writing. And usually I feel like gardeners are really great in terms of bringing this kind of personal edge to their writing. They usually have a very strong personal voice. And I find that quite a few people who are writing in my personal life, in my personal sphere that I know, quite a few of them are actually gardeners. And they write when they feel like it. And so a lot of them will produce copy or writing that is extremely personable and approachable and accessible, and a lot of people love reading their stuff. I find that accessing your inner gardener is really great when you are trying to do a quick writing exercise. Let's say you are struggling with feeling creative and you just feel really humdrum. Giving yourself a random prompt and then just forcing yourself to do some kind of like stream of consciousness rant, or to just write something out on the paper, even if it's a jumble of words. This kind of more organic approach to writing is a great way to help jumpstart your creativity, inspiration, loosen up those creative muscles that might have tightened up over the past few days, and in some ways releases you from the burden of achieving that one goal or getting that thing done. Okay, so those are all of the pros. That's the pros of being a gardener. But there are some cons. So if you are writing a novel, or even worse, a series of novels, in my opinion, depending on the complexity of your novel, you are not going to want to be a gardener. And if you're trying to attempt, like, let's say a fantasy series, holy moly, being a gardener will put you in a position where you're just going to be overwhelmed. You're going to write something, and then you're going to hear back from your editor or your beta readers, and they're going to be like, this doesn't make sense. And you know why? Because there are going to be lore inconsistencies. There's going to be probably erratic character development. The world building might be shoddy or lackluster or forgotten, right? And this can make a gardener feel like the writing isn't good enough, when in reality, they just simply haven't planned for all of the little details that can bring a series to life. Gardeners can also just feel overwhelmed by the blank page, because if they're only going in with the barest of a sketch, they're going to feel overwhelmed about how to implement the vision that they have. And so this can result in procrastination and writer's block. And yeah, this writer's block can really hang around. I mean, if you don't know where you're going, your uncertainty is going to increase, right? And if you don't feel it, then you're not going to write it. And that's why gardeners are going to struggle with being self-disciplined, with maintaining a schedule, with basically making a living out of their writing, because many gardeners, especially at the beginning, many gardeners are going to struggle because they're not going to understand intuitively how to achieve the vision that they want. Now, over time, a gardener can keep working at it so that over time they can compensate for this with more writing experience, but generally leading up into making money or going a self-publishing route as a gardener. That can really put you at a disadvantage. I faintly remember George Martin being a gardener. I could be wrong, but if he turned out to be a gardener, I wouldn't be surprised. Gardeners generally struggle with completing things because they're just really, really just going with the flow. And sometimes the flow is just not going the way you want. So do you discipline yourself somehow? Do you give yourself some sort of restrictions? How are you going to do it as a gardener? Yeah. So if you're a gardener, you might have to learn how to give yourself some kind of accountability, institute time management practices that will help you get some kind of writing done during the day, if that's what your goal is. If you're writing a novel, what you're going to have to do is allow yourself to be very open-minded to get feedback from beta readers and editors. Because If you are writing a series, you need to keep on top of those consistencies, particularly if you're writing for an adult genre. So if you're writing for adults specifically, let's say you're writing hardcore fantasy or hard sci-fi, you are going to need a lot of help. Okay, that's just the way it is. But if you're writing like a kid's book or like a blog, gardeners are going to excel really well there because they're going to be so personable and approachable. People are naturally going to be drawn to their writing. Okay, then let's talk about the architects. Well, the good thing about architects is that they are motivated. They're not going to struggle as much necessarily from writer's block born out of uncertainty because they know what they need to write. They have everything planned. And if they've done a really good job with their planning, right down to the actual scenes, where the scenes are, which characters are in the scenes, who's saying what is being achieved by the end of that scene. If they've broken their scenes down to like micro details, then it's really simply a matter of self-discipline, focus, feeling, like you're in a mental space, and then just sitting down and writing it. So there's a way in which architects can avoid writer's block because of extreme micromanagement. And because of this micromanagement, a lot of architects will have done all of the footwork in terms of world building, plot consistency, character consistency, thematic consistency, and plot consistency. So all of these things will naturally make more sense when it's run by an architect because architects are going to keep tabs on everything. And this will make architects powerhouses when it comes to putting out content regularly and putting out content that is tied to larger IPs or brands or things that will last for a long period of time. So you want an architect running an MMO narrative, for example. You want to have an architectural approach if you're doing a major fantasy series like, let's say, Game of Thrones, with a lot of details, a lot of stuff being juggled. You really, really need to be on top of all of the details if your audience are those nitpicky types who are like, yes, but there were 2 moons in that scene. And this was 4 weeks later, so the 2 moons should have come around. But, that's how like crazy some people can get. And gardeners, like Tolkien was a gardener, would often struggle with having to rewrite certain details in their stories because of moon phases and things like that, which I recall Tolkien had a little issue with. So he had to do some narrative juggling in terms of travel and stuff like that. And so once again, if you're an architect, architects can just kind of avoid some of those pitfalls right off the bat. And the pre-writing strategies that come naturally to an architect actually will help the beginning stages of writing. So as an early beginner writer, if you're naturally an architect, you're going to find writing to be less overwhelming and disempowering. You're going to feel more confident because you're going to naturally make plans for yourself so that you can approach and tackle each section of the project with a sense of empowerment because you already know what you're going to write. And what's even more interesting is that the architect's pre-writing strategies can apply to all forms of writing. And so the skills, the organizational skills that an architect has will apply to fiction and nonfiction alike. So it's almost formulaic to a certain degree, but still very helpful. So when I'm ghostwriting, it doesn't matter if I'm writing fiction or nonfiction. I'm going to make an outline with the client usually, and that outline is going to detail what is going to happen in every single chapter. And the hope is that this will allow me to get my work done in a timely manner. Now, does this mean that architects are some god tier writers? No, because the architects also have to struggle with the cons that come with being an architect. Okay, so for example, architects can often end up becoming stagnant in their creativity. So instead of taking risks, they're just going to go the tried and true route with some stuff. It's kind of like music these days. You know how they're normalizing certain chords and everything in music, and they have like these 2-minute metas or these 3-minute metas, and you got to have your bridge and you got to have your hook and all of this, right? And so making music has become a bit formulaic, especially if you want to kind of make that perfect little tune that's going to become a massive jingle. Well, that means that taking risks as a creative goes out the window if you're pursuing that formula. So if you're a romance writer and you want to make a ton of money, you're going to follow some very set tropes. Okay, fair enough. But if you take that too literally as an architect, you may fall into the rut of stagnation and not taking any risks and not drawing your readers along with you into new realms of possibility. I think some architects also come up with this cool plot that they love. Maybe it hinges on a gimmick, and when it's very clear that the gimmick really doesn't work on a thematic or emotional level or psychological level or something like that, unfortunately, some architects can really get hung up on the gimmicks or the plot gimmicks. Or, like you have those people who talk about, subverting expectations, or the surprise ending, kind of like the Shyamalan surprise ending. If it doesn't have that surprise ending, it's not good enough. I think that's usually a sign of someone smelling their own farts, and it's usually an architect, right? Because they're more in love with the idea of the idea than the idea itself. And that's a real problem. And sometimes the plot becomes such a heavy weight for the architect that the character growth is actually really unnatural and ham-fisted. Architects are going to also have an issue with characters maybe growing too fast or too slow because they are trying to fit some sort of world building, lore related timeline, and it just doesn't make sense. And architects will sometimes plan away those organic, almost spiritual, aesthetic moments that could be happening if they let themselves loose a little bit. And finally, one thing that I have seen is that world building and lore exploration for an architect can become a time sink. There are some people who literally sit around with themselves or with friends and are just creating world building systems or lore systems for something, but they're not actually writing. They're just talking a lot about everything surrounding the world and the characters. And it's really strange to me, but there are people who do that. And to me, that's a time sink. That's a real time sink because it is an abuse of the architect's power to conceive of possibilities. There has to come an end date period where you need to let go the lore and just write the damn story. Maybe that's partially my personality of like, at the end of the day, at somewhere, it's going to be like, like for me, it has to make sense at some point, right? There's a breaking point for me where I can take so much, being on the edge, so much pushing the envelope, so much brainstorming. And then at the end of the day, there's a line for me. There's a line in the sand that's like, okay, we've done enough talking. Now what do we do? So maybe that's just a personality thing, but I do think at some point architects need to draw that line and be like, okay, now let's get to writing. Does this actually work? Now, the next section I want to talk about is but. So I have some gardeners, and also there have been some baby architects that I've worked with. So as a ghostwriter, I work with would-be authors or people who want to at least have their name on a book or something like that. And so they'll come to me with an outline. A lot of these people have no clue. And they'll give me something. And they'll be like, this is my outline. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, no, it is not. But you can see these events. No, that's a sketch of an outline, but that is not an outline. So there's a difference between, for me, at least, there's a difference between a sketch of an outline and an outline. And in my most anal retentive creative projects that I've ever done, some of my outlines had at least 2 drafts. So there was a sketch, then there was draft 1, and then I would get input on that first draft, and then I would have a draft 2 of the outline. And this was really crucial because if you're going to make money off of something, you don't want to waste time putting your pen to paper unless you know for sure your idea is going to be good. And there is some sense of, in your free time, you can take creative risks and you can try something out. But if you're wanting to put bacon on the table, if you want to get that bread on the table, you're going to have to think about it. And I mean that very seriously. So this is where a lot of people are like, oh, but this is my outline. And I'm like, no, that's just some ideas in a list of some kind. But this does not have research. This does not have any references. That's a big thing for me when I'm writing nonfiction for a client. I'm huge on references. And when people come to me with AI-driven references, I start going mental. I just can't handle it. Get out of here. I don't want to deal with you right now. So that's a problem with nonfiction. So with nonfiction, there is an onus, a burden of getting your information right. I'm a massive hater of misinformation or disinformation. And so for me, I'm like, if you do not have your references, then you got to be paying me to find your references, because I'm not doing this for free. So this is one of the reasons why I almost always reject client-made outlines, because almost no client-made outline has ever been good. There was only one client in my 3 years of so far of ghostwriting, only one client that gave me an appropriately researched and cited outline. There were 2 other clients who were close, but not quite there. But there was only one client who, in my estimation, had a really fantastic outline. And even then, that client was like hyper perfectionist and was like, can you make that outline again with me? And I was like, sure, I'll do the outline again with you. And so it was a fantastic, I would work with that person again, 110%. Fantastic client. What about fiction? Is there room for outlines in fiction? And as an architect, largely architect, I would say 75-25 in favor of architect. Yes, there is. So what we're looking at right here is an outline for something I'm just trying out, just trying to see for fun. It's a fantasy story. So this is the beginning of what will be an outline. Now, as you can see, we just got a list of general events. This is not an outline, okay? Maybe later on, I will show you a more detailed outline once I get it properly outlined. But this is a very general, very, very general sketch of an outline. And it's intended to help me see the skeleton or the bones of the creative project I'm creating. So this outline is not intended to give me information on how I'm going to write it. It's giving me general lore, general narrative information. And in fact, there's not a lot of lore on this page, right? I'm not talking about races. I'm not talking about money or exchange. I'm not talking about any racial differences or political issues. Well, there's some political issues on the paper, but nothing like super detailed or, like over the top. And part of the reason is because lore usually will come into play during the making of the outline. The sketch of the outline, which leads into the outline, is more about the feeling or the general narrative flow of the story. So once again, that's just me talking about outlines. You can tell that I love outlines, and I'll probably do a whole video dedicated to outlines. So why am I a huge proponent for outlines, and why would I recommend even a gardener having at least one slightly defined outline? Number one, an outline will break your vision into workable chunks, so you can do a little bit at a time and feel good. It will help you figure out your actual goals for the projects. So a lot of the outlines that I do for my clients will involve marketing information, so you understand what is your target audience, what kind of tropes are you doing, what kind of themes are you doing, what kind of motifs are you expecting to see, who are your main characters, what are your readers going to take from this book, what kind of place are your readers coming from, why are they reading your book. All of this will help generate and clarify your goal for your book. This is particularly important for nonfiction, but it's also very, very helpful for fiction writers as well. Outlines will help you clarify your themes, your plot, and your character development. It will hopefully help you ascertain any potential pain points or plot issues that you might have. So any kind of plot holes, any kind of weird pacing, any kind of ham-fisted character growth will be dealt with during the outlining phase. And generally speaking, when you are writing nonfiction, an outline is an opportunity for you to actually do your research, get all of your necessary details, and really get your citations down, because you do not want to have to stop your writing. Trust me. You do not want to have to stop in the middle of writing to have to hunt down that missing citation because you need to get like this quote properly quoted in this section of writing. You do not want to do that. You want to have all of your citations and quotes ready to go so that you can just copy paste or, get that citation in there without having to stop and go and do your research all over again. And by the way, you might be going, this sounds helpful for writing an essay. Yes, it is. So if you are currently facing an essay that you need to be writing, please consider this as an opportunity, as a call to action to use an outline. It will make your essay writing so much smoother. By the end of my time in university, I was able to write essays on the fly because I would put a lot more into pre-writing, and this would help me be able to write very, very, very quickly. Now, why am I talking about outlining so much? It's not that I hate gardening. Gardening is very important. There's something about being a gardener that is so liberating and fascinating. I was one time writing a fanfic, and the fanfic I had planned to last for 75 chapters. It was a big thing, right? It was going to be 75 chapters long. I had everything plotted out, planned out, everything. And about a third of the way in, I realized that I had it wasn't a huge issue, but it was enough of a plot point that made me think, why is this happening? And because I wanted to answer that, I went on an exploratory journey to answering this question, and it ended up adding 20 more chapters onto my story. So, do I regret that? No. But what happened is I went into it with a plan, and in the process, I kept myself open for possibilities. And so there's something very powerful about keeping that gardener sensibility alive, even if you're an architect. And if you are a gardener, I encourage you to keep or to develop, in your case, you might have to actually work on it because it's a bit like a muscle for you, to develop the ability to control yourself for a few minutes and write down your ideas and evaluate your ideas before you just start spewing onto a page. And the reason why I really want to encourage outlines and architects is because I feel like architectural writers get less representation. Whenever I hear a famous author talking about their writing process, I don't know what is, it must be a personality thing, I'm not sure, but it just feels like not many of them talk about immense amount of planning. There are some, There are some authors who have come out and said, oh, I planned this. But so many of them, like even classical writers, like Tolkien, for example, was a gardener. So many of them talk about their writing experience as this is the way to do it. And it makes other authors who are a bit more studied in their approach look or feel bad or mercenary because they're not approaching it from necessarily a place of emotion. They're coming at it from a place of logic, or I have an idea and I want to explore it. And there is a current paradigm ongoing right now in the entertainment industry, which I brushed up against as a ghostwriter, by the way. I've worked with creatives from the, entertainment complex of the West Coast. And let's just say that there is a paradigm right now, which Clownfish TV has touched on, which is the group creative process or the communal creative process. And honestly, that lends itself to a lot of people just kind of like throwing ideas into a pot and mixing it together. And it's all sounds very cozy and witchy, but it drives auteuristic architects crazy. Now, does this mean that you can't get a group of architects together? No, absolutely not. I think it would be great if we could get a group of architects together. I have a feeling that Final Fantasy XIV CBU3 actually has a group of architects. Clearly, Ishikawa has a more architectural sensibility, possibly. Somebody somewhere in there is clearly more architectural. And on top of that, maybe they just have very mature gardeners lending their talents as well. I don't like over glorification of Ishikawa. I think Ishikawa is a fantastic writer, but she is by no means the only writer. Let's all be clear here. There are other people who are equally talented, I'm sure, on her team. And between everybody, I think I get the feeling like it's very possible CBU3 has a few more architects than usual. There's something, though, about this whole group paradigm, this whole communal paradigm that just seems to feed into the rhetoric of just feeling with it and saying yes to other people's ideas. And it just doesn't feel architectural. But we should not mistake auteurism, that is to say, individualized creativity, as being architectural in its nature. There are many gardeners who work on their own and don't want other people inputting in because they need to be true to themselves. So once again, I'm not suggesting that communal writing is only gardeners, but there is this kind of approach that feels a bit more, I guess maybe it's because too many people don't want to trigger other people and they don't want to be mean. And so then maybe even architectural writers end up just quashing any concerns because they just want to get on with the project or get along with everyone else, or they don't want to be fired or what have you, right? So I have been in situations where I've had to work with an editor and a client and maybe even a third editor. And and I hated those projects because I always felt like, oh, I got to think about those other people. What are they going to say? Like, what are they, and it just slows everything down. It's and another thing that I really want to emphasize is that architects should speak out, because I believe architects do have the answer to a lot of issues that people are struggling with right now in terms of consistency through series. So, for example, the Thor franchise, in my opinion, is suffering hugely from consistency. And I think Feige might have the makings of some kind of architectural ability, but it certainly doesn't appear to be without flaw. And so the Thor franchise for me has been poorly handled, and I think it would have benefited from having an architect overseeing that IP, because Thor ended up kind of embedding itself in several other films, and it felt like things were spiraling out of control, in particular for that IP. for some reason. I don't know why. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes there, but yeah. And then thinking about MMOs, thinking about TV series that last for several seasons. It's so annoying when you see a character behaving one way about a situation in one season, and then because plot requires it, they are suddenly behaving another way in a very similar situation in another season. So all of this could be avoided if you had somebody who was more architectural, who was planning things. And finally, something that I haven't really put on the slide, but I'm just going to pop it in here anyway. I'm a huge lover of complex narratives. And I do believe that although Tolkien's work, Lord of the Rings, is incredibly complex in terms of world building and everything behind it that it's referencing, in and of itself, the narrative is not complex. It is linear. If you're going to write time travel, if you're going to write any kind of memory loss or anything like that, you need to have an architectural eye somewhere on that script. If you are going to be like Dorothy Dennett and write an extremely detailed kind of plot that ties back to the first chapter of your book, you are going to need an architectural eye somewhere. Either an editor or beta reader or both, or you yourself need to be architectural. If you are writing mystery stories, you will need to practice architectural strategies because you need to plan your clues and have your foreshadowing appropriate. Now, of course, there's going to be shitty mysteries out there because, you're going to have gardeners who think they can write a mystery story. And it's going to turn out, in my opinion, not very well. So if you want to write mystery, if you want to write long-term series, let's say an MMO story or a fantasy novel series that's quite long and involved, like Wheel of Time, or The Malazan Empire is another one, or even Warhammer 40k probably has some kind of architectural strategies, keeping everything, in one kind of in one kind of shape, Anyway, yeah, like you're going to need an architectural eye. And I just feel like when people talk about the creative process, when they're talking about, oh, it was just so difficult, we worked so hard, oh, like they're not passionate, all of these kinds of things obfuscate what is required in order to maintain a cohesive plot. And this obfuscation sometimes comes from a place of gatekeeping and the part of the creatives, like the writers, who are like, it will come to you, and it's just very like, ooh, and that's not helpful for a young writer, and certainly not for a young architectural writer. And so I really feel like if we're going to talk about why is a story not making sense, what is happening here, why is this falling apart, maybe it would be helpful to kind of ask, how can writers lean into architectural strategies in order to keep on top of their sprawling masterpieces? And that's why I encourage architects to speak out, because I do think the artistic community has enough rhetoric going on about passion and feeling it and emotional wellness and things like that. And those are all very, very helpful and good things to talk about. But there's also something to be said about dedication, accountability, and organization. Just, is it just me? Is it just me? Or am I a cranky old lady? You let me know in the comment section below. But hopefully this has given you a lot of food for thought. If you are a writer, I hope you feel encouraged, whether you are a gardener or an architect. Don't be afraid to walk on the other side and try something out, because you never know if you'll feel inspired from that kind of exploration. And once again, if you are kind of in a space where you just might not know what to do next, make sure that you have a friend who is an architect to help keep you on track, to help you keep organized, especially if you are a gardener. Well, that's going to be it for today. Thank you all for listening. I hope you have a lovely evening. Take care.